The operating room lights had a cold, white clarity that seemed to cut through everything else. They hung above like small moons, making the stainless steel instruments gleam and turning breath into a visible rhythm under the mask. Dr. Marcus Reed sat on a low stool beside the table, his gloved hands folded for the first time in hours, feeling the rough weave of the disposable gown beneath his palms through the sterile fabric. The smell of antiseptic filled his nose, sharp and almost reassuring, while the distant beeping of monitors kept time like a nervous heartbeat. He had seen many goodbyes in rooms like this, but he had not expected a whisper to rearrange how he would see his own life. Elena Morales, 35, hair streaked with a premature gray and a small bracelet of faded beads around her wrist, reached out with fingers that trembled and mouthed words soft as moth wings. "Stay with me," she said, without sound, but her eyes made the plea audible. Marcus leaned forward, the cool of the surgical glove pressing into the back of his hand, and answered as if saying it aloud might anchor something fragile. "I will be right here," he said, unaware that the promise would outlive the hour and come to define him in ways he had not imagined. A simple whisper before surgery, a soft plea, and a vow for a presence would unfold into a story of compassion, second chances, and ties that bound a doctor to a stranger beyond the walls of the hospital. Who was Elena beyond the pulse and the chart? Why had she held that bracelet so tightly? And what would happen when the monitors stopped holding their breath? The first encounter, in a way that mattered, happened not in a waiting room, but in the slice of time before anesthesia took her away. The room smelled of coffee and the faint perfume Elena always wore, a citrus note that clung to the surgical cap. Marcus adjusted the intravenous line and sat on the edge of the bed, as if he were talking to an old friend. He asked quiet things because loud questions sounded rude in such a space. "How did you get her to the hospital?" he asked, and his voice was a low instrument that filled the small space. "A neighbor found her," she answered haltingly, and then closed her eyes as pain tightened the lines of her face. "Do you have family?" she asked, and there was a pause, a small metallic clink as the bracelet hit the sheet. "No," she said, "I am alone." Marcus felt that word like a small blow. "You are not alone now," he said, and he meant it then and there, but she could not see the map of his life that led him to offering that phrase. The exchange continued in measured breaths, with an intimacy that felt like holding something hot and fragile. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Yes." He answered partly, and then laughed a soundless chuckle through his mask. "Why did you become a surgeon?" he asked, drawing them into a conversation that would span minutes, but feel like an hour. "For reasons I do not always understand," he said. "I wanted to fix things. But not everyone can be fixed," she said softly, and the silence grew heavy. Marcus touched the bracelet with the tip of a glove, as if to feel its temperature, and asked, "Can I hold your hand?" She nodded, and the contact registered as warmth, a small electric certainty against the sterile sheet. This scene was full of careful small gestures, offered at cost. His presence a sacrifice of sleep and meals. Her whisper a surrender that would return in his dreams. Around them, Nurse Karen moved with hushed efficiency, adjusting tubing, her shoes tapping softly on the linoleum. Dr. Aisha Patel checked the chart and gave Marcus a curt nod. Samuel Ortiz, the chaplain, waited in the doorway as if not to crowd, and Tom at the front desk had already paged the family line that never came. The room was crowded by people who mattered and by those who had no name in the record. The promise to stay hung between them like a fragile thread. Marcus had a past that arrived in fragments, in the pauses between cases and in the private corners of tired elevators. He had grown up in a house where the kitchen table doubled as a study area, a hospital bill desk, and a dinner table all at once. The flavor of ionic toothpaste and evenings lit by a single lamp shaped the memory of his childhood. His mother, Rosa, had worked nights at a textile plant, her fingers nimble and smelling faintly of oil and starch. He remembered the sound of her humming while she sewed a missing button on his school shirt, and the way she pressed his forehead during fevers with a cool cloth. That closeness taught him about care and about the small dignity of tending another person. He left his hometown to study medicine on scholarships, carrying a small worn backpack and a photograph tucked into the lining, a picture of his younger sister Lucia with a crooked smile. Training was long and merciless and marked his body in ways he only admitted to himself in bleak residence room conversations. The scent of stale coffee and ammonia forever linked to the years he had spent learning how to take apart human bodies and put them back together. During residency, he had been praised for steady hands and criticized for being too invested for his own good. There were nights when he had to choose between following a code and offering comfort, and sometimes the code won and comfort was postponed. The loss that reshaped him had arrived quietly a few years ago when Lucia called while he was on call and said that she felt tired, and then that call had been followed by another. The silence had stretched, and when he ran to the ER, the diagnosis was too late. The taste of copper and guilt had lodged in his mouth and would not dissolve. He began to understand the limits of what he could repair and the hollowness of apologies after. He had learned to carry quiet rituals to keep himself steady: a cup of black tea at dawn, the scent of lemon oil on his hands before surgery, and a bracelet his mother had braided that he wore under his scrub like a talisman. Those rituals did not erase his mistakes, but they offered a map back to who he wanted to be. When Elena whispered, "Stay with me," the words pressed on parts of Marcus that had been raw for years and brought back the memory of another bedside and another promise he had made and failed to keep. That memory pushed him forward in the room as if redemption could be traced in the arc of his palm across a pulse. Elena was no ordinary case in the chart, and the discovery that followed unfolded like a folded page, revealing notes written in a hurried hand. After she was stabilized in recovery and the breathing tube removed, her fingers combed the edge of her gown and found a small paper square tucked into the fold. Samuel, the chaplain, noticed her reach and stayed close, offering a tissue and a steady voice. She unfolded the paper with care, as if it were both a talisman and an accusation. On it was written a drawing of a small house and a sentence in cramped letters: "Thank you for staying." The ink was smudged and smelled faintly of citrus, like her perfume, and the drawing reminded Marcus of a childlike promise. Karen, the nurse, recognized the handwriting as belonging to a boy in the pediatric ward. "Miguel," she said quietly. "He has been making drawings for patients during his chemo breaks." The revelation landed in the room like a new light. Elena's hands trembled more, but now from something that was not only pain. She asked Maria, a volunteer, if she could see the pediatric art box, and there, among crayons and sheets, Marcus saw a string of similar house drawings, each signed Miguel. Who was Miguel? Where did he come from? Miguel turned out to be a neighbor, a shy 12-year-old whose mother, Emily Chen, the social worker, had introduced to a hospital volunteer program to pass the afternoons. Miguel's drawings were simple but full of big windows and open doors, and Marcus realized the bracelet on Elena's wrist had a bead that matched the one on a picture Miguel had taped on the pediatric wall. That matching bead became a small symbol that tied a patient to a community and to a boy who drew houses as if to assure them they were possible. The room smelled of lemon and paper and something warm. In the cup of cheap hospital tea left on a tray. For Elena, that paper and that drawing were not only an object, but a lifeline, a reminder that someone had seen her and had wanted her to stay. For Marcus, the discovery was a hinge, It moved him from performing a task to entering a story he did not know he belonged to. Once the connection was clear, Marcus found himself taking steps that were not in the usual clinical script. He spoke to Emily Chen, the social worker, and asked bluntly what resources were available. Emily explained in patient, clipped sentences how the hospital partnered with local shelters and a city program that could assist with temporary housing and job placement. She listed names and procedures, and Marcus noted them, the way a surgeon notes instruments, because plans are scaffolds that keep people from falling. "Did you mean to include this in her chart?" he asked. And she shrugged in that way that social workers do when the work bends rules for good reason. "We try to make room when a person opens to us," she said. Tom, the receptionist, had already printed a list of contacts and passed it to Samuel, the chaplain, who promised to sit with Elena in the evenings. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a sense of responsibility that reached beyond the scheduled rounds. He arranged an internal meeting. Karen called Dr. Aisha Patel and asked her to cover the clinic the next morning, while Marcus would follow up with a family meeting. Aisha agreed, and in the brief exchanges, her voice carried a steady confidence that Marcus thought of as ballast. He walked the hospital corridors with the list in his hand, the fluorescent lights humming above, and thought about logistics. He learned enough about the housing program to know the intake form required documentation and references, and that the wait list could be long unless someone vouched for immediate risk. Emily offered to submit an emergency application, but warned there were interviews and background checks that took time. Marcus decided to vouch. He wrote a letter explaining his assessment, signed his name and dated it, and then took the extra step to call the program director, Rosa Alvarez, to explain Elena's fragile situation. The procedural explanation was pragmatic. "There is an emergency intake form which requires medical validation and a social report," the director said in 28 seconds of clinical voice. "We prioritize acute risk, and hospital referrals with documentation will get a slot faster." Marcus sent the forms and stayed late into the night, shepherding paper like a worried parent. The small acts of paperwork felt like labor he did not mind doing, and even carried a taste of wood smoke and coffee with it as he stepped outside for a moment to clear his head. The investigation and mobilization were not glamorous, but they moved pieces in a system that often felt immobile. Names like Rosa, Emily, Karen, Samuel began to sound like a chorus rather than a list, and Marcus began to understand how a network of people could knit together to keep someone from falling through. The next meaningful encounter took place in a cramped consultation room, where Elena sat wrapped in a hospital blanket, clutching the bracelet to her chest, and Marcus entered with a pile of paperwork and an offer. This scene required a slow dialogue because the decision it contained was more than clinical, it was moral and personal. Marcus began. "We have a place to apply for emergency housing," he said, and he placed the printed intake form on the small table between them. Elena looked at the paper and then at him. "Are you sure this applies to me?" she asked. Her voice had a brittle edge. "Yes," he replied. "I filled out a letter on your behalf and called Rosa at the intake office." He paused, then added, "They will need to meet you, and there will be questions." "Will they ask about my past?" she whispered. "Yes, they will ask about your history and your needs, and they will want to know if you have any supports," she said. "Do you have work?" he asked. "Not exactly," she answered. "I used to clean houses, but after the surgery and the bills, I have not had steady hours." He leaned back, his chair creaking softly, and admitted, "I know people at a community center that run a job training program." Marcus watched her weigh the words, and then he offered a choice, which in itself was a gift. "You could stay in the program if you want. We can connect you with Emily, and Miguel is part of a volunteer group that helps with meals, and the kids will greet you with drawings." He looked at her, not at the chart, and added, "I cannot promise everything, but I can promise to be in your corner." Elena exhaled a long, shaky breath, and then laughed, a small sound of disbelief. "Are you really doing this for me?" she said, as if testing a dream. "I promised," I said. "I will be in your corner," he repeated. They had 8 exchanges. Then they went for 2 more, as doubts tumbled in and back and forth. They named fears, logistics, paperwork, checks, references, and past betrayals. In the final exchange, Marcus said, "There may be hard days, but you will not be alone." And she nodded and let the words enter. The dialogue was punctuated by small sensory notes: the roughness of the blanket, the coffee stain on the table, the faint squeak of the chair, and the way sunlight angled through the blinds, like promise. At the end of the meeting, Karen hugged Elena with practiced warmth, and Samuel offered to sit with her for paperwork. The proposal was clear: assistance with housing and a path to work. And the offer contained a cost for Marcus: his time, his reputation, and the emotional labor of being responsible for another adult's fragile trust. The moment of doubt arrived a week later, and it came with the force of memory and self-question, a tension that would test Marcus in a way clinical training had not prepared him for. He found himself standing in front of the community center where the job program took place. The brick smelled of rain and old paint, and the hum of children echoing from a back room. The director, Rosa Alvarez, was waiting with a clipboard. Miguel was there handing out paper houses as part of an art project, and Emily had organized a small welcome meeting. Marcus had to decide whether to step beyond a doctor role into one that would stretch his professional boundaries. Would he sign off officially on this support and keep checking, or would he defer to social services and keep distance? The internal debate felt like a tightening braid in his chest. He remembered Lucia's last day and the way a promise had failed him, and feared repeating the pattern. He thought of the bracelet and the whisper of "stay with me," and felt the weight of an oath. For 3 long minutes he paced the curb. The air tasted of wet dust and distant frying oil. He went inside and met Rosa, and then stood in front of a small circle of volunteers and patients and said in a voice that was both steady and honest, "I am willing to vouch for Elena and to coordinate with the hospital in the short term." He watched faces register skepticism and relief. He knew this would mean more phone calls late at night, more paperwork, more emotional exposure. But he also felt a strange rightness in naming the obligation. The scene lasted in his mind as a pressure point, a choice between professional distance and human involvement. In the end, he decided to lean in, and the relief was immediate and yet complicated. This moment of tension tested his boundaries and invited him to accept a new form of responsibility that was less clean but more real. Acceptance was not instantaneous. Elena moved into temporary housing arranged by the intake team and began attending a job readiness class at the center, which smelled of warm soup and crayons. She learned to answer interview questions and to stitch a patch onto a uniform under the watchful eye of a job coach named Luis, who had once been a mechanic and now taught sewing as therapy. Marcus followed with steady check-ins and small acts that mounted into something larger. He attended a community meal where Miguel announced proudly that Elena had helped him fold paper houses and had shared stories of a home she used to have. The environment tasted of tomato stew, and the air hummed with voices. Aisha stopped by the center one afternoon to run a free clinic and brought along a portable stethoscope and a box of donated vitamins. Karen organized grocery deliveries on Sundays, and Samuel arranged for transportation to appointments. Names accumulated. As threads, Rosa, Emily, Luis, Tom, Aisha, Karen, Samuel, each with a role and a kindness. Elena began to show up for shifts at a local linen service, where she learned to manage the rhythm of an early morning and a steady paycheck. The first check was small, but it felt like a sunrise. She saved some and bought a thicker coat for winter, and one evening brought Marcus a piece of bread and said with a flood of gratitude, "Thank you." and the words tasted like reclaimed dignity. Marcus watched as a small gesture like that bracelet and that drawing moved beyond symbols into everyday proof of reconnection. The center recorded outcomes, and within weeks, the data showed a drop in missed appointments and a small rise in program attendance. Marcus sat with the spreadsheets because numbers meant resource allocation, and he wrote recommendations to hospital leadership describing how medical teams partnering with community programs could reduce readmissions and stabilize recovery. The technical explanation was concise. There was an intake pathway supported by a clinical letter, emergency housing protocols, and an integrated case manager to coordinate care and follow up. Marcus wrote it plainly, in 297 characters, to make clear the steps and the credibility behind the help. The transformation was messy, practical, and palpable. Elena began to smile with a slow, new steadiness. She reconnected with a sister who had relocated to another state and texted that she was proud. Her bracelet no longer merely a token, it became a symbol of a net that had caught her when she fell. 3 moments of higher stakes came, and each had to be worked through with care. The first was the surgery itself, where monitors dipped and alarms demanded action. Marcus and his team had to navigate a complication, and the tactile memory of saving a life returned to him in a rush of practice and calm. The second was the day a bureaucratic error threatened Elena's housing slot, and Marcus had to call Rosa and advocate firmly until the paperwork was clarified and the intake manager relented. The third was a late night when Elena called with news that she had been offered a permanent job, but lacked the last reference needed to finalize boarding for a transitional apartment. And Marcus sat at his kitchen table writing that reference and signing his name as a person who believed in her. The tension in each pile of moments contained doubt, memory, and choice, and together they formed a spine to the larger story. Change rippled outward. Miguel's teachers noticed he seemed more settled and less anxious during sessions, and the pediatric ward reported a softer mood among the children who had an odd comfort in leaving drawings for adults like Elena. The community center recorded 3 new volunteers we came after hearing the story, and 1 local business donated toiletries for a welcome kit. Elena, after a few months, had a routine that included work, a savings account, and weekly visits to a support group where she met others rebuilding. Marcus had conversations with hospital administrators and secured a small pilot fund for a program bridging acute hospital care with community housing resources. Aisha lent clinical leadership and argued for a liaison role that would sit between departments. The pilot included a clear pathway for documentation, a formalized emergency referral process, and a commitment to measure outcomes over 6 months. The early numbers were modest but promising: reduced readmission rates, improved follow-up, and a tighter safety net for individuals at immediate risk. The stories behind the numbers mattered too. At a small celebration held at the community center, Elena stood by a folding table and held Miguel's drawing, where the house had a larger door than before, and she smiled with a steadiness that looked like hope. Marcus watched and realized that the whisper, "Stay with me," had become a chain of presence, a community practice, not a solitary promise. 1 month later, Elena had a small bed in a transitional apartment, a kitchenette that smelled faintly of lemon, and a mail slot that accepted bills without judgment. She had been given an assigned case manager and met weekly with Emily to sort out benefits and paperwork. She had attended 4 job readiness sessions and completed a certification in hospitality basics. Her bracelet was no longer just beads, but a memory she wore with pride. Miguel had visited carrying another drawing, and their friendship had settled into something mutual and bright. Marcus had kept his promise to check in, and his calls were brief but regular. He had written a reflection to place in the hospital's learning library about how clinicians could err on the side of compassion and concrete action. The harbor of small supports had held, and Elena reported feeling safer and less alone. She had returned to the community center to assist in folding linens for a day and found a rhythm that turned work into a place of dignity and payment into possibility. The first month was a brittle time of adjustment and hope, but the structure around her was stronger than when she arrived, and that steadied the small shocks of daily life. 3 months later, the pilot program Marcus had helped launch had enrolled 8 hospital referrals and 2 had transitioned to permanent housing placements. The center now scheduled a weekly clinic supported by Aisha and a rotating team of volunteers led by Karen and Rosa. The hospital reported a small but meaningful decrease in emergency visits among enrolled participants, and Marcus's report had been accepted as a recommendation for wider adoption. Elena had secured a part-time position at the linen service with benefits and had begun to save for a deposit on an apartment of her own. Miguel had improved attendance at school, had been nominated for a community award for his volunteer drawings, which had become a symbol on posters and on a local charity's website. The local business that donated toiletries now funded a weekend meal program that fed 20 families, and the slices of kindness multiplied. Marcus had begun offering a monthly workshop for medical staff on bridging clinical care with social resources, and each session smelled of coffee and purpose. The community had moved from reaction to design, and a new vocabulary of support emerged, using words like dignity and second chance and recomeço, translated in practice to actions that mattered. 6 months later, Elena signed a lease on a small apartment with sunlight that pooled on the living room floor in the late afternoon. She had a furnished bed and a table with 2 mismatched chairs and a stack of drawings Miguel had taped to the wall. She had steady shifts at the linen service and a savings cushion that would pay for a basic emergency. And she had reconnected officially with a sister who helped with logistics. The pilot had expanded into an ongoing program with funding from a local foundation, and a formal liaison position had been approved, which Emily now filled full-time. The hospital leadership named it the Continuity Care Initiative, and Marcus saw other departments replicate elements of the model. Miguel's artwork had become a small emblem of the program, and the bracelet that had once simply been a token now sat in a shadow box at the community center as a reminder that one small connection had catalyzed something larger. For Marcus, the months had rearranged priorities. He found himself declining an offer to move to a private clinic, turning instead to hospital leadership to grow the initiative. He wrote a short piece for the local paper about the power of presence, and the piece was quoted by colleagues who said his words carried a humility they admired. Elena came to the hospital months later not as a patient, but to bring a tray of homemade empanadas to staff and to thank the team who had kept a promise to stay with her. She hugged Marcus in a way that was neither needy nor distant and said simply, "Thank you for staying." And he understood then that the whisper had not been a plea, but the start of a partnership that involved many hands. If this story touched you, and you felt the cold of that operating room and the warmth of a borrowed promise, you are not alone. Share with us the small act of compassion that changed your path or the path of someone you love. Start your comment with "once" to make it easy to read and to invite others into your memory. Tell us briefly what happened, who was involved, and how that gesture made you feel. Your comment can be as simple as a sentence or as long as a story, because every example helps. Show how gestures, even the smallest ones, can become the scaffolding for dignity and recomeço. By writing, you might give someone who is watching this video the courage to reach out to a neighbor, to volunteer at a center, or to speak up in a hospital meeting and help someone stay. And when you share, please remember that behind each story there are people, a network, a community that made the difference, and your words honor them. In the end, the casement of initial care, the whisper and the bracelet, the drawing, and the dozens of small acts of paperwork and phone calls and extra rounds of kindness stitch together a new fabric. Elena had rebuilt enough of a life to stand on her own feet, and Miguel's drawings became a language of hope for others. The network that had gathered around one patient expanded to include Rosa, the intake director, and her team, Louis, the job coach, Aisha, the surgeon who lent clinical time, Karen, the nurse who organized deliveries, Emily, the social worker who coordinated benefits, Samuel, the chaplain who provided evening company, and Tom, who always printed forms on demand. All of them were named not as saviors, but as participants in a shared project of dignity. The technical process of referrals, intake, documentation, and follow-up became smoother because someone had cared enough to move papers and make calls. And Marcus's story changed too. He learned that being a doctor could mean stepping into messy human systems, and that some promises were kept through collective action rather than solitary heroics. The last image lingers. Elena's bracelet catching a strip of light as she opened her door that first morning in her own place. And Marcus standing aside smiling, not for credit, but because a whisper had become a community's promise. If this story moved you, share it, and consider what small gesture you might offer today to help someone stay with us and to keep hope circulating in the places we call home.